these are my 4 favorite romance adaptations, which I can watch at any moment for comfort, for angst, anytime I just want to feel. First up is North and South, which is a novel that was written in the 19th century by Elizabeth Gaskell. Now, when the BBC adapted this to series, they honestly thought nobody would be interested because North and South is not like an Austen novel or a Bronte novel. It doesn't get even half as much love as those people. However, what they did have was Richard Armitage. This is a novel that is primarily about class in Britain in the wake of the Industrial Revolution, which is a pretty heavy topic. So on the one hand, you have Margaret, who is beautiful and light and noble and principled, and she comes from the beautiful, scenic, rural England that is so beloved of British literature. If Margaret came up to me and said, you know, my friend growing up was Peter Rabbit, I would not be surprised. And then at one point, her father, who's a clergyman, because of course, decides to move them up north to this fictional city that is sort of based upon Manchester. And in many ways, it's sort of presented, especially in the adaptation, as a sort of fall from grace. You know, you have this sort of beautiful, scenic England where everything is light and roses. And then all of a sudden, her father suffers a crisis of faith and they're moved to this mill town where the class differentiations and the incredible poverty that affected England at the time is much more difficult to ignore. And in the middle of this town is John Thornton. And when Margaret first meets him, she is absolutely repulsed because he is very firmly of this world that she doesn't really understand. She thinks he's rude and crude and violent and unsympathetic, and she's always trying to counsel him to become a better human being. And he kind of takes her interest in him to be something much more personal than she intended. Which isn't entirely his fault, you know, there he is struggling to survive, and then suddenly the rural England fairy shows up in his life and is like, why won't you be a better person? Whereas there's nobody like her in his world. What follows is much angst, there are misunderstandings, crossed wires, fortunes are lost, tragedy strikes, a bunch of poor people die, all the usual stuff. And not to be all spoilery, but at the end, when the two of them find each other again, it is possibly one of my all-time favorite resolutions. I highly recommend it. Next up is the adaptation of Emma by Jane Austen, starring Romola Garai and Johnny Lee Miller. Now, those of you who know. This is possibly the most perfect adaptation of Emma, and I don't care who knows it. I said what I said. I know there's a bunch of you who love the latest version, but I'm very sorry, Romola Garai is Emma. In the words of Austen, she's handsome, rich, and clever with very little to vex her or disturb her over 21 years of life. You'd think that's an easy role to play because all you need to be is like beautiful and entitled, but it's very easy to build up a resentment and a dislike of Emma because she does so many things that are dislikable, and she's such an idiot and an interfering busybody who doesn't know her butt from her head. So the ability for the actor playing Emma to engender affection and sympathy in the hearts of her viewers is a skill that I feel most people don't give the actors enough credit for. And I've definitely seen versions of Emma where it's really hard to feel any kind of affection for that character. But Romola Garai manages it. I've also heard people complain about the casting of Johnny Lee Miller because they're like, well, of course Emma's going to fall in love with him. Look at him, he's perfect. Whereas in the novel, Knightley is much more of a surprise love interest because Emma goes through the entire book going like, well, I can't possibly be in love with this guy. I've known him all my life. He's just the guy that lives next door and is my really good friend. Whereas if you were living next door to Johnny Lee Miller in those clothes, I'm willing to bet that you'd have that conversation with yourself every other day. And it definitely wouldn't take you 21 years to figure out that he's the guy. So I get it. I get the complaints. But am I complaining? Oh, hell no. Johnny Lee Miller is just perfection in this role. He knows how to disapprove without coming off like a dad. And that's an underrated skill for male actors, in my opinion. Way too many of them go weirdly paternalistic when they're trying to act disapproval and directed towards a young woman. But at no point in his performance does Miller try and condescend to Emma. It truly is a friend relationship, the ultimate friends to lovers trope. So if that's a trope that you like, then I think Emma is just perfect for you. And this adaptation in particular, hands down, my #1 recommendation. And since we're on the subject of Jane Austen, let's talk about my next favorite adaptation, which is Kandukonde Kandukonde, which is an adaptation of Sense and Sensibility. And in my opinion, it is possibly the best Austen adaptation that has ever come out of India. Those are big words, but I mean every single one of them. For one thing, look at the cast. As Eleanor, we have Tabu, who is one of the finest actors in the world. You can see her right now in the BBC's A Suitable Boy, which is also airing on Netflix, I believe. And whatever the quality of the series or film that she finds herself in, she herself is always never less than excellent. This woman can convey more with one look than most people can do with a full monologue. And then we have Aishwarya Rai, who has never been better in my opinion. There are a bunch of films that she's done in Hindi. I mean, she's only done a couple of films in Tamil, which is the language of this film. But I honestly feel her performance in this was just pitch perfect. She's unaffected. She's on note in every scene. She even sells her romance with Colonel Brandon. And you know how we were talking about how Johnny Lee Miller was like too pretty to be Mr. Knightley? Well, Mammootty is the perfect Colonel Brandon. And I know those are big words considering Alan Rickman played him. But there's a pathos that Mammootty brings to the role that is entirely different in my opinion. He really is a tortured older man who understands that he doesn't have the right to fall in love with this beautiful, perfect human being. And he sees her at her worst, and he's still able to understand her demons and forgive her for it. And he holds her to account, but he does it with so much love. Mammootty is one of the finest actors that we have in India, and he does these amazing roles. And this one is probably one of my all-time favorites. And that's going to piss off a whole other section of people because they're like, well, you know, he has played the lead in a bunch of other movies, and I feel like it's not the length of the role, it truly is what you make of that role. And he is such a good romantic hero in this one. He's actually even better than the younger, more conventionally attractive young men who are paired opposite Tabu and Aishwarya. And they also make his backstory a lot more sympathetic than Colonel Brandon's own backstory in the original novel, which is kind of creepy, to be honest. And it also has one of my all-time favorite Aishwarya Rai songs, which, I mean, it's a marvel, just in terms of cinematography, but also as a song. The entire soundtrack is by A.R. Rahman, who is a genius. And all in all, it is by far my favorite Sense and Sensibility adaptation. And that is keeping in mind that I love Emma Thompson and I would die for her. But facts are facts. My last favorite romantic adaptation would have to be The Age of Innocence. Now, when you say Edith Wharton, I don't automatically think Martin Scorsese, but I would be wrong. This is a novel about high society, and in many ways, when you think about it, the upper classes have a lot in common with the mafia. They both have their own rules and they associate within certain prescribed circles. They close ranks when threatened. You're expected to behave in a certain way. There are all these unspoken rules that you're supposed to follow, betrayal of which leads to, well, in the case of the mafia, it leads to death. But I mean, there are tons of novels out there about women who transgressed against societal rules and then slowly died of consumption or something. So the punishment is kind of similar. This adaptation is possibly the most beautiful thing that I have ever seen in my life. It's Michelle Pfeiffer, who is a goddess. I feel like not enough people worship loudly and frequently at her altar, and I would like to change that. But she plays a more experienced, tragic figure who comes back home after a disastrous marriage and bumps into the fiancé of her cousin, her much younger cousin. And the two of them immediately have sparks, but they don't want to betray the young cousin, which then becomes their main obstacle. But if ever there were two people who just needed to get together, it's these two. I have never wanted to do sexy times with Daniel Day-Lewis, but in this particular movie, holy mother of God, he has never been this beautiful and he has never been this hot. He's incredibly repressed and yearning and just perfect. So if you're looking for something to watch, if there's one of these that you haven't seen before, or if you've seen it already but you'd forgotten, then you're welcome. Romances at their best just make you want to live. They're just such an explosion of emotion without any guilt for it. And we can sometimes be living in a world that is constantly trying to guilt us for feeling too much. And these adaptations remind you that it's perfectly reasonable to feel that way. For more videos, please hit the subscribe button.